Hi, everyone. It's Tanya again. I have another book I want to talk to you about today. It's called One Last Word by Nikki Grimes. It's a book of poetry that she wrote. It's inspired by poets from the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to go more into what she did. There's actually poetry and information about poets from the Harlem Renaissance included. And then she writes poems um, based off of famous poems they've written. Um, but it's a really cool book. It's another book that uses counter storytelling to reflect, confront, combat racism, stereotypes, oppression. It's a powerful book that you could use in your classroom to have discussions, to get kids involved in activism, and to get kids thinking about history and present day, and how have things changed, how much has changed, what do we need to still work on to continue making the world a better place for everyone. Throughout this book and in the poems, there are themes of racial bias. It addresses identity, difficulties with identity, and the the scary situations you can get in, but how you can why it's important to be yourself. Pride, beauty, and it's set. Nikki Grimes, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about her. She uses a lot of her own life experiences to reflect on these different topics. So she is an African American poet. She grew up in Harlem, New York. She didn't have an easy life growing up, and she reflects on this through poetry. And so I'm going to share with you a web page. This is Nikki Grimes' web page here. And it goes through her books, her blog. There's all kinds of things that you can click on. What I found really interesting is when I came down to this, to historically speaking. This is something that I would have students in my class read to get a background of Nikki Grimes and how she uses the stories of, or how she uses her experiences growing up in the inner city, and her experiences being an African American, growing up in the 60s, and then what she sees today as an inspiration to write her poetry. And so, like I said, she grew up in Harlem. She grew up reading the poetry written by the poets from Harlem Renaissance. Her parents separated when she was young, and she ended up was bounced around from relatives, and ended up living in some foster homes, and had some really bad experiences, but also had a really good experience in a foster home. And she writes about that in this history. She talks about in her history here about a teacher that really saved her. It was an English teacher who saw her talent in her writing and really pushed her to focus on education. I guess she kind of mentions that she was maybe veering into a different path and that wasn't going so well, and so she really feels like this teacher saved her. Her teacher was a survivor of the Holocaust, and so she was inspired by her teacher because she knew if she was able to survive that, then yeah, things were really hard for her, but that she could have the courage and the resilience, like her teacher, to face the tough things that were going on, and she would just focus on her education and think, okay, how can I make my life? There's these negative things happening, but how can I make my life better? And so just reading her background, reading Nikki Grimes' background, I think can give you some awesome topics to begin talking about before you even start reading the poetry in one last word. And I just want to read a little excerpt that I thought was interesting, that just kind of goes on to what I was just saying about how she uses her life story to write, especially because we're talking about counter storytelling and how powerful it could be to talk about different difficult topics. The second great thing about being a writer is that everything in my life becomes fodder for my books. My childhood church experience gave me the fuel for Come Sunday. A special friendship led to meet Denitra Brown. My memories of a tour of China mushroomed into Tai Chi morning, snapshots of China, and so it goes. So I think it's just cool that, that she references like how she can use her life stories to inspire her writing. And then I think about how cool it is for kids to be able to read these things, especially this poetry. I'm going to read a couple of poems that I've picked out. But I think about kids and their experiences and how they can read this and connect and say, okay, yeah, I'm going through something that's hard right now. And now I can read this poem and I can relate to what's happening to this character in this poem. And a lot of the poetry in here, they're talking about difficult things that are happening, but it's inspiring because they're saying, yeah, this happens. Racism exists. Oppression exists. People have ugly perspectives of others based on skin tone, ability, based on their income. But we can break that cycle, or we can overcome that cycle by being ourselves, by being prideful of who we are, by not letting them tell our story, by not letting others tell our story, by us telling our story. And so it's a really, I think, inspiring book in that sense for kids, so they can see others who are similar to them. And I think it's a really good book for kids who maybe are always reading literature about themselves and maybe haven't had a lot of experience with diversity or diverse literature. So it can kind of combat that superiority that they might feel, where they need some diversity in their life. And so they can see that there are others in the world that have talents, that have gifts, and they can kind of have some empathy to see how the world can be ugly to others, and how courageous and resilient these people can be, and how what can they do to help combat that. Okay. So before I start reading, I kind of want to talk about what Nikki Grimes does in this book of poetry. Let me go back to me. So she writes, the poems in this book are called Golden Shovel poems. And so what she does is she takes poetry from the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm going to kind of talk about why she uses those poems, because she talks about that at the beginning of the book, where she gives a little background of the Harlem Renaissance and why she wanted to focus on those. But she uses this poetry called the Golden Shovel poetry. And basically what it is that you take a short poem, or you take a line, like a powerful line from a poem, and you create a new poem with the either short poem or the line from the poem. But you use the words from the original poem, but you arrange it in a single line, word by word, in the right margin. So she had a good example in here, is if she was going to take the words in the right margin and use it for her poetry, she would line them up like this. And then her, it's hard for me to show that, where it says in the right margin. And then she would add her own words in front of those words. So she takes, like I said, she takes poems from the Harlem Renaissance and creates these golden shovel poems. And so, a little background of the Harlem Renaissance. It's from 1918 through the 1930s. Harlem exploded with African American music, art, literature. A lot of this reflected racial pride, addressed inequality, was very inspirational in the civil rights movement. It was pre-civil rights movement, but inspirational in the sense of it was the first time that we really saw an explosion of African Americans showing, hey, look at me, look at my story. I'm telling my story. I'm showing my gifts. Than what people with the world had seen before. And so it was it's important. And I'm going to read what she says, why it's important, because I just really think her words are powerful, what she says about it. Through the decades, this literature has reminded readers of all races how vital it is that we define ourselves, set our own paths, celebrate our own capabilities, and determine our own destiny, no matter what obstacles are placed in our way. I just love that. And so, yeah, it's totally important. And I think kids need to hear this, of why we want to read this poetry and why we want to continue to celebrate it, and why she used this as a springboard to write poetry today. And then just thinking about how you can learn from these people's experiences. The writers of the Harlem Renaissance had slavery had just been abolished not that long before. There was a Jim Crow South. People were being lynched, and she talks about this in here. And so they're going through all these experiences, and she talks about how you can learn from them, about toughness, survival, and having a positive attitude. And how these poets used their own stories to do these things. So through the power of storytelling, they were able to say, hey, I'm gonna celebrate myself. I'm gonna celebrate my freedom, and I'm gonna fight for justice, even though the world isn't where it needs to be when we're talking about these kind of topics, and it still isn't. And so that's one of the reasons why she wrote this, is because there's still work to do. And I think that's just a powerful message for kids today, and for everybody. I mean, for everybody today, but for kids in my classroom, it's powerful. So I've got two poems that I picked out just to kind of highlight how she uses this book, how she uses counter storytelling in this book. So what I'm going to do is read the line from the poem that she used. So like I said, she used poets from the Harlem Renaissance. So the first poem that she used is called Life and Death, and it's by Clara Ann Thompson. Clara Ann Thompson was a school teacher in Ohio. She lived from 1869 to 1949. So she was a school teacher, but in her free time, she wrote poetry, and she would go and read poetry, perform her poems. Both of her parents were former slaves. She came from a very artistic family. She had siblings who were poets and who were sculptors, or had a sculptor in her family. Her brother actually was a poet and helped her publish her first book of poems in 1908. And then she also wrote a book of poetry um, that was right around the time the Harlem Renaissance was really gaining strength. And her book of poetry focused on celebrating World War I soldiers who were African American. And so her whole book of poems celebrated them and addressed the fact that many of them weren't celebrated like they should have been, and honored like they should. And so she did it through her poetry. And so this poem was called Life and Death, and I'm just going to read the lines that Nikki Grimes then uses in her poem. We live, and how intense is life. So full of stress, so full of strife, so full of hopes, so full of fears, of joy and sorrow, smiles and tears. And oh, how fruitless is the quest, unless we're striving for the best. And so that's the line that Nikki Grimes uses. And I like it because you can see the comparing and contrasting the good things and the bad things in life, but how, no matter what, if we're not doing the best we possibly can and fighting for the best, then what's the use is kind of what she's saying. And so here I'm going to read Crucible of Champions. And so she took those lines to create her Golden Shovel poem. And here she has different characters. She's got Jamar, Dinah, Helena, Damien, Cora, and Blake. And so she tells each of their stories through this Golden Shovel poem. And just I like the title Crucible of Champions. And in this poem, she's really just addressing identity, being yourself. And I'm just going to say that, and then I'll talk about it after I read it. So Jamar, the evening news never spares us. Tune in and we hear. If you're a boy and you're black, you live with a target on your back. We each take it in and shiver, one sharp-bladed question hanging overhead. How long do I get to walk this earth? The smell of death is too intense. And so we bury the thought, because the future is ours, right? We get to choose. Well, we choose life. Dinah. Stupid is the word that stalks me. I'm anything but so. I seethe inside. Even on a good day, I'm full of an anger that burns my breath. Why? It's all because of my diagnosed dyslexia. Ask me to read aloud, I stress. Whenever the teacher calls on me in class, I stutter. So most folks surmise that my head is hollow. Actually, it's quite full. My words and letters simply switch places. They've got a mind of their own. I call that reason enough for stress, for strife. Helena. I've never met a marine biologist, so what makes me think I could be one? My head is full of fantasies that don't fit other people's ideas of what's possible. They tell me I should squeeze my hopes into a miniature box of their design, but I'm not so inclined. Their infinitesimal perceptions are not for me. I'm full as a piñata, stuffed with daring and delectable dreams of all I can truly be. There's hardly room for doubts, for fears. Damien. No one cuts you any slack if you're a boy, especially of a particular hue, and you decide to find your joy in ballet. Never mind that it's as tough a sport as any, and gives you a perfect place to pack whatever sorrow shadows you. Flex, point, leap, and you're all smiles before you know it. Dance is demanding too, and the strength it takes would have most jocks in tears. Cora. Lips zipped, I fight to keep silent, to fit in, and when I speak I whisper. It's silly, I know, but oh, don't the boys love it? Besides, it's how the popular girls behave. It's tiresome, though even fruitless, to pretend to be somebody you're not. Like Mom says, life is too short. Better to take a lonelier road, discover the who of you. That journey is the best quest. Blake. Coach reminds me I'll be stuck in a do-nothing job unless I win one of the basketball scholarships we're all after. Would steroids multiply the effects of my striving? I consider giving them a try, but cheating is not for champions. I'd rather pass the test for the strongest, the fastest, top-notch version of me. Then I'll truly be one of the best. I love this poem because I really think it talks about, and I love the fact there's all these characters because I think it could hit so many kids that are going through different crises with identity, with just people's negative perceptions that could be bringing them down. So we hear, the different perspectives that these kids, or the different experiences that each of these kids are going through. Like Jamar talks about how his skin color makes him have a target on his back, and how scary it is, and how he thinks about, because he's black, how dangerous it can be for him in the world, but how he doesn't want to focus on that, because then he's just going to be going through the world terrified. And so he doesn't think about it. He's saying the future is mine. I'm going to choose, and I choose life. And so I think I just really like the lessons in each of these characters' stories. Dinah talks about how she has dyslexia, talks about her disability, and how people just think she's stupid and assumes that she doesn't know anything because of it. But how she's actually got a full mind. And that, that people might think that, but she knows that she's smart. And that, she's gonna, no matter what people's perceptions, she knows that she's got a full mind. Helena, I think this goes into gender. She wants to be a marine biologist. How people have, a perception of hers, like, why would you think that you need to be that? But I love that she says that she's as full as a piñata, and she dreams of all that she can truly be. There's in that she's pushing those doubts and fears aside, and ignoring those negative perspectives that people are placing on her by telling her that she shouldn't dream so big. Damien, his story, he talks about how not only does he have a particular color of skin tone where people look down on him, he also likes ballet, goes into stereotypes where boys aren't supposed to like ballet. But I love how he counters that by saying how much strength you have to have in order to do ballet, and how most jocks would be in tears if they tried it. And so, he finds pride in what he does, even though people have negative perceptions of that. Cora talks about how she acts and how she's speaking a certain way, because she knows the boys like it, and how it's how popular girls behave, how she's trying to fit in. But then she thinks about what her mom has said, and takes that to mind, and thinks, okay, maybe it's better, instead of worrying about fitting in and being this certain way so boys like me, I need to focus on, taking a lonelier road. Life's too short, and I need to discover who I am. I'm going to focus on me and not what people want or expect me to be. And then Blake's story talks about how he wants a basketball scholarship, how he needs it so he can be successful. And he struggles with the idea of using steroids. But then he decides, no, that's not who I am. I don't want to cheat. I want to be my best self, and I want to show what my best self by passing the test without cheating. And then I'm just going to show you the picture that's included with these. The artist that did this, her name is Elizabeth Zunnen. She's from Albany, New York. She grew up, her childhood, she spent a lot of time in the Ivory Coast in West Africa. And so a lot of her art is inspired by West African fabrics and vegetation. But I really like this image. I think it goes with the first poem. Hold on. Let me think of Jamar. You see it's a young African-American male walking, but he's looking behind him. So he's not, it's a pretty scene, but I feel like he's looking behind, looking over his shoulder, because he doesn't feel completely safe and secure in this world, because people have negative perspectives based on his skin tone. I think it's important for kids to see that others feel that way, and I think it's important for kids who don't feel that way to understand that kids of color may feel that way. People of color have to fight these stereotypes and fight that fear. And so I think it's a pretty cool, powerful poem to address different identities and different issues that people have and how they overcome them. Okay, and then the last poem that I'm going to talk about is called The Sculptor by Nikki Grimes. And she wrote this Golden Shovel poem based on a Georgia Douglas Johnson poem called Calling Dreams. And she only used one line from Georgia Douglas Johnson's poem. It says, "The right to make my dreams come true." And so that's what she used. Georgia Douglas Johnson was from Atlanta, Georgia. She ended up settling in Washington, D.C., but she was very well known, a very well-known African-American woman poet. She was a playwright also and a columnist. She was highly recognized up with like Langston Hughes and County Cullen during the Harlem Renaissance. She was very involved. Her house in D.C. was often used as a place for writers to come and meet and discuss ideas and share ideas. She was one of the first African Americans that were published in white mainstream media, so in Harper's and in Century. And, I think it was important because not only was she African American, she was a woman. So I'm going to read the poem that Nikki Grimes wrote based off of Georgia Johnson's poem. It's called The Sculptor. No accident of birth or race or place determines the scope of hope or dreams I have a right to. I inventory my head and heart to weigh and measure what talents I might use to make my own tomorrow. It all depends on the grit at my disposal. My father says hard work is the clay dreams are molded from. Yes, molded. Dreams do not come. They are carved, muscled into something solid, something true. And I just want to show you the illustration that goes with it. It's by Corby Cabrera. She lives in Brooklyn. She attended Parsons School of Design. She's known for handcrafted dolls that she makes, and collectors from around the world collect them. But she's also illustrated 5 books. This is the illustration she made to go with this poem, and you could see how large the girl's hands are in this poem. She looks content to me. She's got there's a beautiful beach behind her. She's holding beautiful flowers. But then I just kept looking at her hands and how important they seem in the image. And it goes back to talking about how the sculptor and how we are in charge of sculpting our future. We we get to decide how our future is going to be. We're not going to let someone else write that future for us. And I think it kind of just goes back into the how we can use counter storytelling to combat stereotypes, oppression, racism, by telling our own stories, and then how we get to decide what our future is going to be. We're not going to let things such as birth, race, or place determine what our hopes and dreams are. You can overcome it. It might take some hard work. Again, the world is full of ugliness. We're all going to experience, have some kind of experiences where we think, oh man, how am I going to get through this? But I think one thing we can do is we can take inspiration from others who have gone through major struggles, and sometimes struggles that are bigger than anything that we've ever seen. And we can see how they overcame, and how they have found happiness, success, joy, by persevering and by being resilient. So I think, reading these stories can be very inspirational for students, for anybody, but especially for students. And it can help students see that, yeah, there's ugliness, there's ugliness that's happened in the past, there's ugliness that happens now, but there are ways that we can combat that, and there are ways we can come together to fight that. So that's all. I hope that you check out these two amazing books that I talked about, and I will see you all next week with my new book that I'm reading.